All right, well, welcome everybody. It's really good to see all of you. I know by this time of the semester things are getting a little bit dicey for everyone, for students, for faculty, for anybody who's at all involved with students or faculty. So especially appreciate your presence and your participation here tonight. So tonight's lecture is sponsored by the Department of History, by the Latin American and Latinx Studies Center, by the Department of Ethnic Studies, and then the Center of the American Past. And I'm Thomas Andrews. I'm a history professor, and I'm director of the Center of the American West. So again, thank you for being here. And it's our pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Danielle Olden from the University of Utah. And Danielle is from not super far from here in the bigger scheme of things. She's from Laramie, Wyoming, and did her undergraduate degree at U of W, and then went on to earn her master's and her PhD at Ohio State University, or as some people insist on calling it, the Ohio State University.
Not me.
Yeah.
I think that's a question.
I'm really not sure what that's about. If anybody knows, please explain it to me afterwards. So Professor Olden is going to be talking to us tonight about her prize-winning, actually multiple prize-winning book, Racial Uncertainties. Copies are for sale in the back of the room. So, and I think that this is it's an incredibly pertinent topic, of course. Not only are we in the Denver area, but colorblindness and sort of politics of race and of racial denial and all of that keeps resurging. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Olden. Yeah, go on.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of the end of your semester to join me here today. I'm excited to be back on campus. I did a little bit of my research for the book here as well as in Denver, and I always have really lovely experiences here on campus. So thank you for welcoming me. This is based on the book, Racial Uncertainties, Mexican Americans, School Desegregation, and the Making of Race in Post-Civil Rights America. Yes, it is a mouthful of a title. To my editor's chagrin, I insisted on it. And so the talk tonight is sort of an overview of like the larger project, and then I sort of dive into sort of smaller parts of the book a little bit more. So I'll just dive right in. On April 18th, 1974, Lila Lewis, a parent of 4 Denver school children, stood in front of the Board of Education, and she actually presented pictures of each of her children to the school board. She asked the board if they could identify the race to which they belonged. When no one responded, she did not wait for an answer, but rather continued to make her point that her children's racial identity could be easily mistaken. Because, she said, her children were mixed race, with varying shades of skin and facial features and Spanish surnames, they were inconsistently racialized by the school district. When she asked for documentation from the schools, officials sent her a letter that named 2 of her children as, quote, Anglo, and 2 of them as, quote, Hispano, even though all 4 children had the same parents and the same last name. She told the board that there were thousands of students just like her children in the district who were being incorrectly classified, and she said it was the prerogative of parents like her to be able to choose the race of their child. She demanded that administrators create some sort of questionnaire to be sent home with children so that the parents could fill it out. That way their racial identity would be more accurate, she said. Lewis's appeal to the Board of Education illuminated a long-standing, inescapable reality. Race was, of course, not a scientific or natural phenomenon, but a social construct, easily altered, shaped, and negotiated. In a system of racial understanding that was structured around a black-white color line, Mexican Americans presented a challenge. Were they white or were they non-white? Neither teachers nor administrators could look at Lila Lewis's children and determine their race without considerable discussion and debate. The fact that the 4 of them had been classified differently, 2 as Anglo or white and 2 as Hispano or Mexican American, demonstrates the uncertainty inherent to racial processes. Yet the fact that she felt compelled to present her appeal to the board reveals the absolute centrality of racial understanding to her children's educational experiences, indeed their very well-being. But why did she go to such lengths to discover how the Denver schools had officially designated her children's race? Why did she care? Well, just 10 days earlier, District Court Judge William Doyle had issued his plan for desegregation in the Denver public schools, calling for redistricting the entire school system, a part-time pairing plan, and busing students to achieve maximum racial balance. Racial balance, of course, meant that each child had to be racially classified and then distributed throughout the city. The order paid particular attention to Black, Anglo, and Hispano students. Depending on how a student was racially categorized, they could remain in their neighborhood school for all or part of the day, or they could be bused to a school in another neighborhood for all or part of the day. Race, therefore, was of the utmost importance to parents like Lila Lewis. In Denver, the debate over school desegregation was not only about the constitutionality of court-ordered desegregation. In a city that had never mandated segregated schools, the pros and cons of busing, or the social upheaval and violence that accompanied integration, it was also centrally about the meaning and application of race itself. But how do we understand this? Let's go back a little bit. In 1969, parents of 8 school children filed suit against the Denver Board of Education and the Denver Public Schools. They argued that school officials had deliberately segregated students, quote, minority students from, quote, Anglo students. And they sought the immediate desegregation of Northeast Denver schools. Keyes versus School District Number 1 was the first non-Southern school desegregation case that the Supreme Court ruled on, and it did so in 1973. And thus it is a very significant ruling. Now, I used the case, the community response to it, and grassroots mobilizations around it to talk about how race was understood in Denver in the late 1960s and 1970s, within the context of the city's battles over school desegregation. And in particular, I examined debates over Mexican-American racial identity. Again, were they white or were they non-white? I argue in the book that these debates were pivotal to the transformation of racial knowledge in the 1970s. As the courts wrangled over whether they were white or non-white, Denver residents tried to maneuver around the court-ordered desegregation plan by claiming alternative racial identities or by pointing out the arbitrariness of racial classifications, the elimination of which, of course, would have made it nearly impossible to create racial balance in the first place. The historical record shows that Mexican Americans were central to these conversations. This history of school desegregation shows that the race work in between Black and white is fertile ground for examining both the complexity but also the absurdity of race in modern America, as well as the longevity and adaptability of Mexican American whiteness. As people tried to articulate, negotiate, and adjudicate Mexican American racial identity, they brought to the surface long-standing debates over the relationship between Mexican Americans and whiteness, and the role of the state in determining racial identity in the post-civil rights nation. And by post-civil rights, I mean basically the period after the mid-1960s. Denver's school desegregation case and the various Mexican American responses to it challenged what had become common sense understandings of race, ethnicity, and culture. As in other cities with multiracial student populations that included Latinxes, their very existence in the public schools forced the courts, attorneys for both sides, school officials, and parents to grapple with the racially in-between status of Mexican Americans. The existence of such racial uncertainty and its utility as a tool of resistance to civil rights are hallmarks of the operation of race in modern America. People's inability to categorize Mexican Americans as either white or Black, and their subsequent debates on Mexican Americans' location along the racial spectrum, right? If we think of race as a spectrum with whiteness on one side and Blackness on the other side, right? What is in the middle, right? Mexican Americans fell somewhere in between the two ends of that spectrum. Right, but where they fell on that spectrum, that was sort of the question at stake here. And the way that this played out, it provided avenues of resistance for parents in the Denver area. That some Mexican Americans were among these voices only added credibility to the idea that court-ordered desegregation was, according to those who opposed the court-ordered plan, right? This showed that it was, in their minds, illegal and un-American as well. Situated in the heart of the American West, Denver was a multiracial city similar to, and yet distinct from, other metropolitans in the West. Metropolises. I can't speak tonight. Although it was a northern city, and Keyes was the first northern school desegregation case the court ruled on, its definition as a western city has, I think, precluded a serious examination of the case by historians of school desegregation and post-World War II racial formation. Here, the multiracial character of the case presented several avenues of opposition to the court's desegregation order. Mexican Americans not only joined those who supported integration efforts, large numbers of them actually challenged the desegregation plan. Now, their objectives for doing so often differed from whites, but they frequently adopted the same rhetoric and tactics as whites who were opposed to the desegregation order. Some of them challenged the school district's racialization of their children in order to point out the absurdity, as they saw it, of an integration plan that required racial balance. Others simply rejected their classification as minority and insisted instead that they were, quote, American. By examining these various Mexican American racial and political subjectivities and putting them in historical context, I begin to suggest important revisions to the history of colorblind racial ideology. By narrowing this study to this one city, I highlight the centrality of the American West and specifically Mexican Americans to our collective understanding of race in the United States. It is when we interrogate the middle of the racial spectrum that we can really begin to see the complexities and contradictions of school desegregation efforts of trying to achieve equal educational opportunities when race is in fact so uncertain and yet so deeply embedded in our social, economic, and political structures. So at this point, you might be asking yourselves, so what? Don't we already know that race is ambiguous? Don't we already know that there is a long history of debate over how to racially categorize Mexican Americans and other Latinxes? And the answer is yes, of course. My scholarship builds on the incredible work of other historians of race and Latinx history who have demonstrated the malleability of race, the complicated nature of Mexican American racialization, and the construction of whiteness. What I try to demonstrate in the book is how the meaning of Mexican American racial uncertainty changed in the post-civil rights context. I argue that various groups, including some Mexican Americans, wielded Mexican American racial ambiguity as a weapon in the civil rights battles of the late 1960s and 1970s. In the post-Jim Crow nation, non-whiteness was no longer a former legal impediment, and a host of new policies, laws, and programs were put into place to protect non-whites from discrimination. So for those of you who don't know, throughout the early part of the 20th century, there was a system of Jim Crow in the South, which was kind of a legally mandated system of racial segregation between blacks and whites. This is kind of the typical classical segregation you've probably learned about in some of your other history class or earlier history classes. That ended in 1964 with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And then following that, then we get the 1965 Voting Rights Act and some other legislation that really tried to address the nation's brutal past with racism. And so in this post-Jim Crow world, Mexican Americans could sort of claim a non-white identity for the first time without sort of legal repercussions. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, that I think it'll make a little bit more sense for you. But in the post-Jim Crow nation, just who was non-white was not always fully apparent. In Keyes, the plaintiffs argued that Mexican Americans were a minority. That's the actual word that they used, minority. A category that they said included both Mexican Americans and African Americans. And importantly, they very clearly and carefully used minority in opposition to Anglo. right? So the plaintiffs in the case who are saying Denver is guilty of segregating students, they're building up a binary, right? So on the one side are Anglo or white students, and on the other side are minority students, which includes for them Black and Mexican American students, right? And they're saying the school district is guilty of segregating these two different groups of students from each other. Now, you can see in this slide, this is evidence that was submitted to the court by the plaintiffs in the case. And I use it just to show you, this is a basic chart showing years of DPS experience. And of course, with this chart, they're trying to show that DPS was placing more experienced teachers in majority white schools and less experienced teachers in majority non-white schools or minority schools, right? That's what they're trying to show. But I use it as just one of many. There were lots of exhibits that were submitted to the court that are very similar, right? But I want to show you the categories, right? So this is like the binary that the plaintiffs have set up. Is on the one side Anglos or whites, and on the other side minorities or African Americans and Mexican Americans. And that's how they really constructed their case to prove that the Denver schools were guilty of segregating students, is by using this Anglo-minority binary, okay? Now the defendant school district, DPS, countered this claim by consistently maintaining that you could not combine Black and Mexican American students in the same racial category because these two groups clearly were not the same, right? And so they argued in court over and over again, you can't combine these two groups of students. Moreover, they argued there were plenty of Mexican Americans in Denver who did not want to be included in the minority category, as they identified as, quote, Hispano, and did not believe they were non-white. And so here I have one example. This is an image that appears in the book. This is from a pamphlet produced by an organization called the Latin American Education Foundation. They operated in Denver in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. And they were really kind of a small organization meant to sort of promote education among Mexican American youth, right? So they kind of raised a small amount of money for scholarships to try to send exceptional Mexican American students to college and things like that, okay? But what was most interesting to me about the pamphlet was this image, right? This was sort of their seal, and you can see in the image, it says a new conquest in learning, and then LAEF, Latin American Education Foundation. And then the image in the middle is what? The conquistador, right? And so this is really showing, I talk about this a lot in the earlier part of the book, but for a lot of Mexican Americans in Denver, their family units had originated, most of them at least, in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. And these were a group of people who called themselves Hispanos, right? And most of them claimed family lines back to that area over centuries, right? So they would say, my family's been in this area since the conquistadors, right? And the conquistadors were who? Spaniards, right? And so what they're really doing is laying claim to a Spanish past, right? And this happened in all sorts of parts of the Southwest, but it's really prominent in this area, northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, what one scholar has actually referred to as the Hispano homeland. And so for a lot of these folks, there's sort of a rejection of non-whiteness, a claiming of whiteness through Europeanness, i.e. Spanishness, right? And so you can see this in this one image, kind of that coming through the image of the conquistador. I break this down more in the book, so I'm not going to spend any more time here talking about it, but I actually analyzed the phrase to a new conquest in learning a little bit in the book, so if you're interested. Okay, so the Hispano then is kind of the identity that most, and I use the term Mexican American in the book, so that's what I'm going to use here today. But most Mexican Americans in Denver identified as Hispano in this period that I'm talking about. Okay, outside of the courtroom, Denverites also debated how Mexican Americans should be racially identified for the purpose of determining whether particular schools, and thus whether the entire district, was segregated. If they were white, the schools were considerably less racially segmented. If they were non-white, however, more schools would be found in violation. And so legally speaking, this was an incredibly important decision with nationwide implications, right? Whether Mexican Americans were white or non-white. Prior to 1973, the Supreme Court had not yet ruled on a school segregation case that dealt with the question of whether school districts without a history of state-mandated segregation were unconstitutional. Neither had the court dealt with a school segregation case wherein Mexican Americans figured prominently. Locally, Keyes highlighted the complexity of race and the significance of Mexican Americans in the operation of a multiracial hierarchy that structured community life. But it also revealed divisions over race, culture, and politics within the Mexican American community. Divisions that led to some Mexican Americans joining forces with the anti-busing movement and ultimately the nationwide turn to colorblind racial ideology. Okay, so very quickly, I just want to show you this timeline just to give you a sense of the period that we're looking at. The case was filed, as I said, in 1969 in U.S. District Court for the District of Colorado, which is in Denver. The district court issued its decision in 1970, and it basically sided with the plaintiffs and said, yes, Denver is guilty of segregating students. There's some complexities to the way the decision was written. Again, I won't get into tonight, but just know that the case is even more complex than I talk about here, and that you should definitely check out the book. So basically, the court sides with the plaintiffs and says Denver is guilty. That decision is appealed, and it goes to the U.S. Appeals Court for the 10th Circuit, which is also in Denver. And the court issued its decision in 1971, which largely affirmed the lower court's decision, saying, yes, Denver is guilty of segregating students. It was again appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1972, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. The plaintiffs and the defendants went and made their case, and in 1973, it was in June of 1973, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, again in favor of the plaintiffs, affirming the lower court's decisions, setting, of course, this nationwide precedent that's very important. After this decision, school districts everywhere in the nation could be challenged, right? People could say, hey, you've created a segregated school system, you were in violation of the Constitution. This is the case that lays the precedent for those many other cases that emerge around the country. Let's see, there's some more legal maneuvering. After 73, it goes back to the district court, and the district court has to create an actual plan to implement desegregation in Denver schools. That is issued in 1974. It is appealed, and it goes through this whole other appeals process, finally resulting in the spring of 1976, when the district court issues what is basically, there's some other maneuverings that happen, but what is basically its final desegregation plan. So my book really traces the period. It's a story about the post-World War II era, but most of the book is kind of focused on that 1969 to 1976 period. Any questions about the chronology of the case?
Well, there seems to be a big gap between 1976 and 1995.
Oh, yes, thank you. The case remained under court order for the next several decades until it was released in 1995. And this follows the trajectory of what happens around the country. There are many cities around the nation that are under court order throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's around the mid-1990s when courts start to release those school districts. Of course, we know now, resulting in resegregation. We're now more segregated than we were in the 1950s, basically. And so yes, that's when. So it is a long period, right? And yes. So there's this whole other part of the case that my book doesn't even talk about, where these battles are continuing to play out between 76 and 95. Yeah.
And you're going to be telling us how people responded to
yes.
that. Yes, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Let's see. Oh, and just to give you a little bit more context, I know some of you are familiar with Denver, but I know some of you aren't. So this is an image that I have in the book. It's just a simple neighborhood map of Denver. So a lot of the areas that we'll be talking about today are northeast Denver. I wish I had a pointer, but I don't. Northeast Denver, kind of that upper right-hand corner. Park Hill, so Northeast Park Hill and North Park Hill are the center of a lot of the litigation, and that's because in the post-World War II era, there's a lot of migration of African Americans into that area. from what had been the historic Black enclave, which was kind of the central city area around 5 Points, Cole, Whittier, around there. That was kind of the historic Black neighborhood. But as more Black families gain middle class status in this area, they're migrating to Park Hill. And so a lot of this drama is playing out in Northeast Denver. But the central part of the city is also very important. Again, that area around 5 Points, Capitol Hill, around there. And then West Denver, of course, plays an important part because that is sort of the area where most Mexican Americans in the city reside. Okay? So just to give you a little bit of sense of the geography. This here just shows you a little bit of data. So when the Supreme Court issued its decision in 1973, you can see the racial makeup of the students in DPS. So majority white, right, that's the first, I should have used some better colors. Majority white students, you can see about 64, 65% white. Another, what is it, like 12, 15%, I can't remember, between 12 and 15% Black in this period, and then about 20% Mexican American. So that's at the point where the courts are going to be determining their plan. You can see how the schools then change over the next several years. By 1980, it has become a majority minority school district. By 1980s, you can see white students make up by that point only about 42, 43, 44%. African Americans, about 20, a little more than 20. And then Mexican Americans, over 30%, 35% of the district. And today that number is even larger. I believe the Denver Public Schools are majority Latinx at this point. Does anyone? I'm almost certain that is the case. Okay, so you can kind of see how the district changes over the course of these years. All right, and then, yes, okay. So when the Supreme Court heard the Keyes case, again, one of the central questions before it was whether Mexican Americans and African Americans could be grouped into this single minority category. And when the court issued its ruling, the court agreed with the plaintiffs that such a grouping was acceptable. So the Supreme Court did actually rule on this question, right? And they said, quote, that Hispanos and Negroes have a great many things in common. Right? And so that was sort of the phrasing that the Supreme Court used. And so the way this is interpreted is that the court was okaying, saying, yes, you can group these two groups of students together because they have similar experiences of discrimination and segregation in a place like Denver. Right? So that's kind of what the court is saying here. Now, among Denver residents, this part of the ruling became a central part of public debate because it so dramatically altered the ramifications of the case. Under Judge Doyle's original ruling, only Northeast Denver schools were affected. Again, this gets into the complexities that I mentioned that I'm not talking about, but that you can read about in the book. So in his initial ruling, only Northeast Denver, that right-hand corner of the city, was affected. Okay, now after the Supreme Court has ruled, now many more schools potentially could be segregated and many more students would have to be involved in a desegregation remedy. The Denver Post staff editorialized that it was strange the justices would make such a decision when, from what they could see, most Mexican Americans in the city did not seem to favor integration. The editor admitted that Mexican American children often experience the same educational inequities as Black children, but he also insisted, quote, that most Hispanos in Denver, the articulate ones at least, apparently do not want their children to have the same degree of school integration sought by most Blacks. While the editorial ignored the diversity of opinions within the Mexican American community, it did highlight the significance of Mexican Americans to the case and their lack of consensus on the issue of busing for racial balance, even after the Supreme Court ruled. And just to give you a little bit, for those of you who may not know, busing for racial balance was the sort of primary method of desegregation that was used in this period all over the country. So basic idea is, in order to create, because neighborhoods are segregated, right? In order to create integrated schools, you have to bus students across the district to achieve integration. So the idea is that if you have a city where there are white students over here and Black students here, that you would take some of the white students here and bus them to the Black area, and some of the Black students here and bus them to the white area, right? So that's what I say when I talk about bus. That's what I mean when I talk about busing, right, is because buses were the mechanism through which a lot of the integration was achieved. But it also becomes a way of opposing integration was to join the anti-busing movement. Okay, so I argue in the book that this story is largely absent from our telling of post-1964 civil rights history. How did Mexican American, sorry, I'm missing a sentence here. Where did Mexican Americans stand in these debates? How did they contribute to or challenge the emerging discourse of colorblindness? How did their very existence shape civil rights opponents' resistance strategies? Busing for racial balance and affirmative action, which was actually often a part of desegregation plans, was affirmative action hiring plans to ensure that school districts would hire more non-white teachers. That was actually a part of what the courts ordered. These were the two issues, busing for racial balance and affirmative action. These were the two issues that most ignited the opposition of liberals and conservatives alike. Their rejection of race-conscious remedies helped nurture a budding anti-classification form of colorblindness, what legal scholar Ian Haney Lopez calls, quote, reactionary colorblindness. As a strategy of resistance to civil rights remedies, hostility to racial categorization has proven a very effective method. It uses the language of anti-racism to argue against race consciousness. The Colorado State Board of Education's brief in support of the Denver School District, for example, argued that race consciousness was a violation of the principle established in Brown, the Brown v. Board decision, if you don't know, that declared school segregation to be illegal. They argued that race consciousness was a violation of Brown because it perpetrated the same racism that motivated classifying students by race during the Jim Crow era. While Haney Lopez applies the term to legal doctrine, it is also a useful way to understand how regular people shifted their thinking on civil rights. Examining the post-civil rights period with Latinxes in mind sheds new light on how this transition occurred. In the time between the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended legal segregation, and the post-1980s rearticulation of anti-racism into colorblindness, questions over Latinx racial identity helped grassroots opponents of race-conscious policies like court-ordered racial balance plans chart out new forms of resistance. So basically I'm saying that opponents to civil rights used the ambiguity of Mexican-American racial identity as a way to challenge civil rights, okay? That's kind of the big argument of the book. It was also during this period that Mexican Americans began to shift their own civil rights strategies away from legal whiteness arguments to racial discrimination arguments. So this is, again, something I discussed in an earlier part in the book, but basically, early Mexican American civil rights efforts used the strategy of trying to claim whiteness as a way to gain inclusion. So they often argued in courts like, you can't segregate us because we're white like you, right? We're just as white as you and you can't segregate white from white. Right? That was the basic kind of civil rights argument that was used in earlier civil rights efforts by Mexican Americans. That shifts in the post-civil rights period to a separate race argument, saying we are non-white and whites have been discriminating against us as non-whites for a long time, and the courts need to recognize that and grant us a remedy, right? A solution. Okay. Now, from a litigation standpoint, this made sense. Right? It made sense to shift strategies because Mexican American civil rights attorneys were now operating in a new legal regime. Legal segregation was over and the federal government now offered protections against discrimination. This landmark piece of legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it allowed Mexican Americans to adopt a non-white identity without putting themselves in danger of being placed on the non-white side of the Jim Crow color line. But this transition was complicated, as both the courts and various state bureaucracies struggled to determine whether or not Latinxes were meant to be the beneficiaries of anti-discrimination law, whether they wanted to be beneficiaries, and how to determine whether one was indeed a racial minority. Mexican Americans, in fact, took an array of positions on their racial and cultural identities, and they did not agree on the issue of court-ordered racial balance, particularly when it threatened their attempts to secure bilingual and bicultural education programs. So as I explained to some of you I've talked to earlier today, when I say bilingual education, that's really kind of the same thing as what we now call ethnic studies, right? So bicultural education was sort of including Mexican American history and culture in the curriculum. Okay, again, what we think of as ethnic studies today. Okay. In 1968 and 1969, when desegregation plans first were being debated by school officials, the diversity of opinions on the proposed plans was on full display. Members of the Crusade for Justice, a local Chicanx empowerment organization, interrupted a packed school board meeting to proclaim their opposition to any desegregation plan that would put Mexican American students on a bus, essentially. It would sort of create racial balance while doing nothing to address the actual problems that they saw in the schools, right, as they related to Mexican Americans. Integration, argued their leader, Corky Gonzalez, was, quote, a misleading proposition in regards to solving the problems imposed upon the children of the Mexican American segment of this society. Rather than the integration schemes being deliberated by the district, the Crusade emphasized Chicanx community control of Chicanx schools. At the same time, the newly formed Congress of Hispanic Educators, or CHE, underscored the importance of an integrated educational setting for Mexican American children. Members recognized that desegregation was not the only solution to the plethora of problems Mexican Americans faced in the Denver schools, but they believed it was a central component. In school board meetings and community gatherings, Mexican American parents, too, displayed a lot of ambivalence about the question of integration, about the question of a racial balance, with some supporting the goal of integration and others insisting it was not necessary to achieve the kind of educational reforms they sought for their children. Again, primarily bilingual and bicultural education. This ambivalence was reflected in a 1972 study of, quote, Spanish surnamed Denverites by a group of social work students at the University of Denver. Though their sample was small, their study indicated that there was no consensus among Mexican Americans when it came to desegregation and busing. In fact, there appears to have been a significant amount of uncertainty. There was more agreement, however, about the need for bilingual education. Finally, when Mexican American students walked out of their schools in the middle of citywide debates over the merits of various desegregation plans in 1969, they revealed their particular dissatisfaction with the educational experiences they had in the Denver schools. Their list of demands submitted to school officials included calls for greater representation, courses that taught Mexican American history and culture, and pedagogical changes that recognize students' diverse backgrounds and learning needs. They also, of course, demanded more Mexican American teachers and counselors. While they recognized a number of problems with the way teachers and administrators engaged with them, they did not articulate a demand for racial balance in their schools. Their vision of educational equality differed in critical ways from what was being advocated by integration proponents. So for those of you who don't know, Mexican American students walked out of the schools as a protest in 1969. This was, of course, a part of a nationwide walkout movement among Mexican American youth, particularly in the Southwest, but also in other parts of the country in 1968, 1969, and into the early 1970s. And you can see here they are marching down the street. And then here you can see a lot of the violence that ensued on the second day of the protests as the Denver police met students out. This is outside of West High School, I believe. And you can sort of see the ways police are engaging with the students and using tear gas and pepper spray on them as well. So this actually turned into a rather violent event. So I talk a little bit about it in the book, but today just know that, the students were making a lot of demands when they walked out. School integration wasn't one of them. That's the important point for today. Now, with the Supreme Court's decision final and a large number of Mexican Americans about to become part of the integration plan, the CHE decided it was time to ensure Mexican American children were actually being represented in the case. Having tried for years to convince school officials of the need for the kinds of programs they wanted, members obtained legal counsel with the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, or MALDEF. And they actually intervened in the case on the side of the plaintiffs. And they did this by saying, they basically sided with the plaintiffs, arguing that integration was necessary But so were other educational reforms. So they're here saying we want integration, but we also want to make sure that our interests are represented and that the court takes our needs seriously. Once again, bilingual, bicultural education programs were their top priority. In order to make their claims, they insisted that Mexican Americans were a part of a distinct race, separate from both Blacks and whites. As students with, quote, inalienable racial characteristics, Mexican Americans had unique educational needs that racial balance alone would not provide. So here's a very clear divergence from earlier Mexican American civil rights efforts, which again used that whiteness argument to try to claim victory in their civil rights battles, right? We're white too, include us, right? Here they're saying we are non-white, but we are also non-Black, and we have distinct needs as a distinct race, and you need to pay attention to those needs, okay? In early 1974, Judge Doyle granted their position, and MALDEF attorneys became the official representatives of Denver's Mexican American community in the case. So it wasn't actually, even though the case involves Mexican Americans centrally, it wasn't actually until 1974 that they are thoroughly represented in the case. Even though the Supreme Court had determined Mexican Americans were an identifiable class under the 14th Amendment, and MALDEF was pursuing their interests as a distinct racial group, the racial wrangling that had been a feature of the litigation since the beginning actually intensified. The Denver public had been debating the issue of desegregation and racial balance for several years. Starting in 1974, however, some parents and other residents began to challenge court-ordered racial balance by disputing the validity of racial categorization, particularly the ways that Mexican American students were categorized by school officials. So this is sort of going back to that beginning story I told you about Lila Lewis showing her children's pictures to the school board. Recognizing the ambiguity of racial categories, as Lewis did, provided avenues for some parents to claim particular racial status in order to manipulate their child's placement in the district scheme to create racial balance. Another parent, Marguerite Cardova, also argued that parents should be able to decide the race of their children and that they should get to change it if they found it was correct. The district's method of classifying them based on teacher observation of hair and skin color and texture, eye shape, and the sound of their name was, she said, simply not an accurate method. Her statement pinpointed the very problem with trying to integrate schools based on legal definitions of race. Race was malleable. It had no inherent meaning, and it could be manipulated to fit the needs of Denver residents. Once the court approved a plan to allow children to stay in their neighborhood schools, if their presence contributed to racial balance at that school, the district was inundated with requests from parents that they be able to choose their child's race. In fact, after so many parents began to challenge school officials on the way their children had been categorized, Judge Doyle was forced to issue more, quote, concrete methods for doing so. So what he did is he ordered an affidavit process. He said, okay, the district is to continue its regular process, which was teacher observation. So I'm a teacher and I'm looking at you and I'm saying you're this, and I'm gonna look at you and I'm gonna mark you as this, and I'm looking at you and I'm gonna mark you as this, right? So teacher observation. Unless a parent found that a teacher had miscategorized their child, then that parent could fill out an official affidavit that declared their true race. In very short order, parents submitted affidavits for 200 students. Now, this seems like in a district of thousands and thousands and thousands of students, this might seem kind of minuscule, but you have to remember the delicate racial balancing that the court was trying to achieve. And so if you have 200 students and there were more that were coming, that's actually throwing, a wrench into the school district's plan, right? Okay, another response to the Supreme Court's determination that Mexican Americans were minorities, which was a large outcry by some Mexican Americans. These were folks who insisted that they were not minorities, right? So these are those folks who I said earlier claimed Hispano identities, right? So they're saying we are Hispano, which means we are Spanish, which means we are white, we are not minority. And they said that over and over again in the language that they use, we are not minority. They tended to be more well-established in the city. Many of them, in fact, were middle class and upwardly mobile. At a school board meeting in 1971, one Mexican-American city leader insisted that his community did not want integration, and he indicated his distaste for being labeled a minority. Hispanos were culturally different, he said, which was not the same thing as the Black situation. African Americans were racially different. When this same individual later ran for the school board as an anti-busing candidate, he claimed to represent the interests, the majority of Hispanos in the city, and he proclaimed that they were, quote, incensed because Judge Doyle's order singled them out from the mainstream of American society. For him, the Keyes case and its racial implications challenged the life he had built within the American, i.e. white, mainstream, right? So he's saying that there are a lot of us Hispanos who are angry that we have been singled out as different. And what he means is different from whites, right? He does not want to be singled out in American society because he's living just fine, right? Okay, now again, I have more I can say about that in the Q&A if folks have questions. Now this sentiment took center stage in 1976 when parents in one neighborhood with a significant percentage of Mexican American residents filed suit against the school board and the district for moving forward with the district court desegregation plan. So that's a little bit of a mouthful. So let me kind of explain what's happening here. 1976, again, there had been various court maneuverings challenging the desegregation plan. In 76, it's official, it's moving forward, and many more people are suddenly like, oh crap, our kid is going to be involved in this plan. What can I do to ensure they don't become a part of the plan? And so one community in North Denver around Swansea Elementary School, and if I go back to the map, Swansea is kind of, Elyria Swansea is kind of up right in the center at the top. That's the neighborhood we're talking about here. So there was an elementary school there called Swansea. And that's kind of the center of this whole issue that I'm going to talk about now. Parents in that area actually filed suit against the Denver Public Schools. Why did they file suit? Because the Denver Public Schools were implementing the court's order in Keyes. Okay, so because the schools were now forced to integrate Swansea, that meant that those students were then going to be bussed out to other parts of the city. Now parents are suing the district saying, you can't do that, you're violating our constitutional rights. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening here. Garcia versus the Board of Education sought relief from participation in the plan by arguing that the plaintiffs' 14th Amendments were being violated. 14th Amendment rights were being violated. Basically, they felt that race should have no influence on where the district assigned their children, and they adamantly rejected the term minority, insisting that they were, quote, American. Now by this, American essentially equates to white, right? And throughout the history of post-war America, there's a lot of evidence, 20th century America, there's a lot of evidence to show that the language of Americanness is really about the language of whiteness. And so that's really what's happening here, right? Now this argument was essentially colorblindness. It was colorblindness 101. They were saying race is meaningless and racializing us demeans our Americanness. They also maintained that the Congress of Hispanic Educators in no way represented their interest, right? Because that was one of the arguments one of the questions the court asked was like, well, do you even have standing to sue here because you were already represented by the Congress of Hispanic Educators? And these parents are saying, no, we were not consulted by them. We don't want integration. They're not representatives of our interests. Because they had not been represented in Keyes, they argued they had a right now to sue the district. Referring to busing for racial balance as, quote, social experimentation, they wanted the courts to release them from the desegregation plan, and they used the rhetoric of whiteness to make their claims. Not only did they reject minority status and claim American, they also insisted on being labeled in ethnic terms as opposed to racial terms, and explicitly distanced themselves from Black integration proponents. Now, this suit never went anywhere. I sort of unpack this in the last chapter of my book, in chapter 6. And what I do is I kind of look at the briefs in this case to sort of get at the different arguments that are being used by the plaintiffs here. Again, really trying to say, we should not be a part of the busing plan because we're white, okay? Now, this case never actually, Garcia, that is, this case never went anywhere. The court did issue a decision in 76. It was appealed. The appeals court for the 10th Circuit issued a decision in 77, and their decision was basically, this issue has already been adjudicated. That's it, right? And so these courts ruled that the plaintiffs had no case and that they had indeed been fully represented in Keyes. either by the CHE or by another intervener in the case, the Citizens Association for Neighborhood Schools, an anti-busing group. So the courts were saying, okay, if you say that the CHE didn't represent you, well, this other organization did because they were an anti-busing group, and so you were clearly represented. But I argue in the book that their suit demonstrates the divisions in the Mexican-American community over racial classifications and the complexity of racial understandings. So, what conclusions are we to draw about how Mexican Americans are implicated in the operation of colorblind racial ideology? So first of all, I really want to emphasize that I am not arguing that Mexican Americans invented colorblindness. I'm not even arguing that they were dominant players in the construction of colorblindness or in its maintenance. However, I do think that this history demonstrates that if we really want to understand how colorblindness functions in American life, we cannot overlook the ways Mexican Americans fit into and help perpetuate its basic tenets. Proponents of colorblindness repudiate racial categorization because they claim first that race is meaningless, irrelevant to modern society, and second, that race is too ambiguous upon which to base law and public policy. In 1970s Denver, Mexican Americans represented the city's largest minority or non-white group. Demographically, this made them a significant part of school desegregation litigation, as well as the plan the court eventually adopted to desegregate the schools. That there was so much uncertainty about Mexican American racial identity proved, according to these anti-integrationists, that the entire desegregation plan was a farce, an unconstitutional farce at that. And the fact that some Mexican Americans agreed with such thinking, and even made similar arguments, propped up and even helped legitimize colorblind opposition to school integration. We need to more fully grapple with these difficult realities if we are, if we really do want, and I think we do, I think we want to expose the insidiousness and falseness of colorblind racial ideology in the present. Thank you.
So much, Danielle. Yeah, so let's open it up for questions.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Can you talk to why after the U.S. war with Mexico, Mexican Americans at that time were called white?
Mm-hmm. So, well, they were legally called white, but that wasn't the reality in social life, right? So, okay, this is an interesting history. So, the Mexican-American War happens in 1848. Basically, what is northern Mexico is taken by the United States, becomes part, basically, the American Southwest, right? So part of the treaty that ended that war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, part of the treaty stipulated that those Mexican citizens who resided in that territory that became the United States, that they would automatically gain U.S. citizenship. Okay, now, in 1848, when this happened, there was a prerequisite for U.S. citizenship. Does anyone know what that was? Whiteness, right? Yes. According to a law going back to the 18th century, there was a naturalization law in effect that made whiteness a prerequisite for citizenship. So the only way you could become a naturalized U.S. citizen was if you were white, okay? And that is law in 1848. And so think about it. If the treaty grants these Mexicans citizenship, but you have to be white to be a citizen, then de facto, that means that those Mexican Americans are white. And that's basically what the court decides in a very famous Supreme Court case in 1893. I think I'm getting that right, the Rodriguez case. And so legally, they are white. But again, that doesn't mean that that's the way they experience life in the Southwest. Very much treated as non-white, okay? And so because of that legal whiteness that exists from the 19th century, that's one of the reasons Mexican Americans in the earlier part of the 20th century used that whiteness argument. They're basically, it made complete legal sense, right? You've already recognized that we're white. That is decided, right? You can't challenge it. And so then they try to lay claim to a more full citizenship by trying to claim that whiteness again in the courts. And they win over and over in the courts. Doesn't mean that they actually win equality, but legally they continue to win with that argument. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And also the repercussions afterward after these Mexican Americans were late citizens.
Oh, yeah.
And they quite repercussions by other white citizens.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Like land loss,
Yeah.
money loss, other property loss, social
They
ostracization.
rejected the whiteness.
Yes, absolutely. That's a good question.
I enjoyed your presentation and the way you deconstructed all of the controversies surrounding colorblindness and things. Do you have any information on the impact that all of this had on the children?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I've been telling people all day, like when I did this research, I really wanted to do oral histories. As I was hoping to talk to people who had been students, who had been children during this period, to talk to them about their experiences in the schools, but also how they think the plan sort of impacted their lives generally.
Yes.
But practical constraints kind of got in the way. I needed to finish graduate school. A done dissertation is the best dissertation I can tell you. I got a job. Luckily, she's telling me that. I got a job, so I was like, I needed to be done, and so I couldn't do oral histories. And then I thought this is going to be an important part of my book revisions once I had a faculty job. And then faculty life kind of just overtook me. I was really busy trying to teach new classes and write new lectures and new obligations. Anyway, long story short, oral histories never happened. So I don't actually have much evidence. There are some like newspaper articles that were written in like the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, kind of talking about the case and commemorating it, where they talk to people who were involved in the case, and you get a little bit of that. And as we were talking about earlier, you were talking about, people who were involved in this litigation too. And it's really a mixed bag, right? There's a lot of students who look back on their experiences and think it was great and say they really had great time, like getting to know different groups of students that they would have never met before, and that it really enriched their experiences. There are other students who are adamant that this was horrible and that all they remember is sitting on a bus for hours every day, which again, that's gotta be not great, right? But they also remember being picked on at school by other racial groups, fights that happened, maybe they were involved in fights. So it's really a mixed bag. Education scholars also debate whether or not this was an effective method, whether or not it's something we should return to. I don't think there's a lot of consensus right now. What we do know is that the end of federal desegregation orders led to almost immediate resegregation in those schools that were able to achieve at least some level of racial balance. It became more difficult because, like I showed you this chart, right? Why did the school district become so much more non-white between 673 and 80?
And for those that don't understand, why was it segregated?
Why were the schools segregated?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other, I talk about that in chapter 2 of the book, the different ways that segregation was manufactured, essentially, and the different ways that African Americans and Mexican Americans experienced their schools.
Well, through redlining.
Redlining, absolutely, yeah, gerrymandering school boundaries, Denver's guilty of all of that, right? No better than Mississippi or Georgia or whatever, right? So there's a lot happening here. There's a lot of in-migration of people of color, but the primary reason for this is white students fleeing the Denver public schools as their parents move out to the expanding Denver suburbs, right? And those suburban school districts are not involved in the school desegregation plan. So we now have a system in which the Denver public schools are majority non-white, while the suburban schools are majority white, right? And the Supreme Court said in the same year as Keyes, 1973, in the Milliken case, that we cannot have cross-district busing or transportation, that's unconstitutional. Because they did try to say, well, let's just bus the suburban kids into the city and the city kids out to the suburbs. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions. So the first is, what factors do you think inflected Mexican Americans' disparate responses to these cases? It seems like class might have played a role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I talk in the book about how I think it has a lot to do with their identity formations, and that has a lot to do with both race or ethnicity and class. There are other things as well. Religion plays a role, language, whether or not you speak English or Spanish or both. All of these things are playing a role, but I see race and class as sort of foundational to this process. And what seems to be happening is that for a long time, people laid claim to this Hispano identity simply as a way of claiming a distinct cultural identity that they could be proud of, right? And there's another scholar who wrote a book about how this identity came to be. It's called The Language of Blood. And I think I'm getting that correct. It's a really great book that talks about the historical process whereby the construction of this Hispano identity goes about. I didn't say that right, but you get what I'm saying. And a lot of it has to do with class, right? So if you're more well off and upwardly mobile, then you're more likely to sort of claim this Hispano or Spanish or white identity. Now, that's not true across the board, right? We're just saying that there are correlations, right? And so class does play a role. But it's not the complete story, right? And so part of what I'm trying to get at in the book, and part of where I'm going in my second book, is how racial identity and ideas about the history of your people, right? So how does that inform racial politics, right? And I mean, that's the question I'm interested in, is what are the factors that are shaping the way people identify, the way they think about race, and then how they respond to the important civil rights issues of this era. That's something I became really interested in this book. And so that's what I'm hoping to explore. I don't have the complete answer. I think I'm hinting at things in this book, but it's really what I'm hoping to examine more fully in the second book, which is going to be on Mexican-American conservatism. And one of the cities I'll be looking at is Denver.
And then just to follow up, I'm curious, like, as a historian who's studying, subjectification, identity formation, how do you navigate writing about those categories and identities while they're in flux, right? Because at a certain point, to make a chart like this, you have to kind of make a call about what things are at what time.
There is a lot of theorization around this, in especially among like legal scholars and historians and other humanists. Ultimately, I'm persuaded by the argument that in order to talk about things, you have to name them. That's the basic argument, is that we cannot talk about what is a very real process, racial construction, without giving it a name of some sort and giving the categories a name. So you have to be clear, and I think I do this in the introduction in chapter 1 of the book, where I'm clear that we're talking about something that's very malleable, something that is changeable, that it's not static, that it's historically contingent, but that I am naming it this because X, Y, Z. And historians have to be really careful about this, about all groups, but it seems particularly when it comes to Latinxes, because there are so many different terms that have been used, right? So in my research, there was Hispano, there was Spanish surname, Spanish speaking, Mexican, Mexican American, Chicano, Chicanx, more recently Latino, Latinx, right? All of these terms are in use. And so you have to be very clear in your writing about why you are choosing to use the terms you are. And a lot of people say, hey, I'm just going to stick to what the historical record says, and I'm going to use the terms that are used in the record. Because I was sort of navigating this period where identities are in flux so much, particularly with the rise of the Chicanx movement in the 60s and 70s, I chose Mexican American because I thought it was the most neutral term during this period. A lot of people would argue against that, and a lot of people would be very much against that term, but I just thought that it was made the most sense for me. And again, you have to name things in order to talk about them.
Mom's first question made me think of this, which is the role of indigenous identity in your story, because of course there are racial distinctions within the category of Mexican American that have a lot to do with mestizaje and the extent to which Mexican and Mexican American peoples have indigenous identity.
So this becomes a really interesting part of the story that I became kind of obsessed with as I was doing the research. So what ends up happening is one of the ways that parents begin to challenge the way their children were racialized by the district is by saying, by claiming an American Indian identity. Now, what was interesting to me is there was clearly a lot of white parents who were doing this, but what was really interesting to me was the fact that there was a lot of parents of mixed Mexican American children making these claims. So there was a lot of people with children who had one parent who was Mexican American and one parent who was white. And so they may or may not have had a Spanish surname. If their father had a Spanish surname, because we live in a patriarchy, they had a Spanish surname. But if their mother had the Spanish surname and their father has an Anglo name, then they had an Anglo name, right? And so a lot of parents of those children kind of came forward, and one of the things they tried to argue was that, hey, we should have a mixed race category, right? And there's a lot of good research, especially from legal scholars and mixed race studies scholars, sort of interrogating why that would be bad for civil rights, why a mixed race category would be bad for civil rights policy. And in fact, I think a lot of people who really buy into colorblindness love the idea of a mixed race category because it undoes race, right? If everyone's just mixed up, then we can't talk about it, right? Then it doesn't make sense. Yeah, we can't document anything. So that was one thing they tried to do. When that didn't work, then they sort of ended up saying, okay, well, if this doesn't work, then I'm going to actually claim my child's indigeneity, right? Which again, if they have one parent who's Mexican American, then that Mexican American parent can say, well, because I'm Mexican American, I'm part indigenous too, right? And there was one parent in particular, I think I have a picture. Oh yeah, here she is, Naomi Bradford. She was the most vociferous about this. And she claimed all sorts of identities in the papers when she was interviewed, and at first she's a PTA mom who's like really challenging the desegregation order, but she ends up winning a seat on the school board in 75. So she becomes this really like staunch anti-busing voice in the city. And she claims to be Mexican, she claims to be Hispano, she claims to be Indian, she claims to be Navajo. She claims her great-grandma was a member of the Cherokee tribe, which if you know anything about claiming Indianness, that's a very common argument. Everyone's great-grandma was Cherokee Indian. And so it becomes a way for them to kind of cleverly show the arbitrariness of race in a way that, again, sort of raised questions about, oh, they're making good points here. Maybe we should question this entire racial balance plan, and maybe we should throw out civil rights law so basically they use indigeneity as a way to further make the argument that race is ambiguous.
But the Chicano movement is also embracing.
Yes, that's what's really interesting.
A very different one, right?
Yeah, so in the book I say, in a way, what she's doing is actually doing what the Chicanos movement is saying, which is to claim your indigeneity, right? So what they're saying in the movement is, let's reject whiteness or Spanishness and let's reclaim our indigenous identity. But I think it's the political motivations behind that process that is the most interesting, right? She's doing it as a way to challenge civil rights law. And that's what becomes really interesting. So this is just an image, sorry, that's Bradford and her family, but this is an image I put in the book, a cartoonist that published in 74 there was this whole debacle in 74 when the affidavit process came out. A lot of those 200 affidavits came from parents at one school in Southwest Denver where Bradford, was the PTA president. So it seems clear that she's kind of really centrally involved in orchestrating this, and all of these, I don't remember the number, but there's like 50 students at this one elementary school or even more who are submitting affidavits saying their kids are actually indigenous, right? My kid is Native American or American Indian, you can't bust them away. And so this cartoonist is very clearly like pointing out the ambiguity of race, and that it's interesting that Judge Doyle is ordering this plan for racial balance when in fact anybody can be Indian, apparently, right? So again, using racial malleability, uncertainty, ambiguity as a way to challenge the plan, as a way to challenge civil rights. Yeah.
So what I was thinking, the other thing having in 73 is San Antonio, the sharing of budgets. Yeah.
I don't remember what year that was. I know
It's
what you're
around the
talking
same
about.
time, right?
Yeah.
So there's like scarce resources,
Right.
And everybody. So I guess to what extent does it even matter whether these folks are thinking of this in terms of identity or just sort of pragmatic, situational? I'm trying to get in this one situation, I'm trying to get a scarce resource, a good school, or the school I want. Do you have Latinx folk Do you have any evidence of people in different situations claiming different identities to get different things? Or are these protests really reflections of a deep-seated identity?
I think it's a little bit of both. So for those who are claiming a Chicanx identity, I think it's a very clearly about, it's a politicization. It's not just an identity formation, it's a politicization. So it's not just adopting a particular identity, it's saying that there's a particular politics that goes along with that identity. And they're very serious about it. So I think that is true. I also think there's a lot of Hispanos who are very serious when they say we are white. When they say we are Hispano, we are Spanish, we are white. But I think there's this other group of people who are willing to use it as a tool, right? As a sort of cynical way to kind of get what they want. And I don't
I guess I'm wondering, not cynically. Let's say dealing with the schools in one way and dealing with the police in another way.
So that's a good question.
Making different claims to get different,
right?
To get different resources or redress.
Yeah, I don't have evidence of that. I mean, I see those two that's happening, right? But it's different groups of people, different groups of Mexican Americans. So around the same time, you have, so for example, police violence, very prominent in Denver. It was a very serious issue for the Mexican American community. And there was protests in the mid-1960s against the police department practice of claiming, in police reports when something happened, of claiming that they were, quote, Mex, which was kind of short for Mexican. And so, interestingly, rather than sort of challenge the police brutality, they chose to sort of challenge the way they were categorized on police reports, but that was a way of trying to stop police brutality, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there was one group of people making that argument. They said, you need to mark us as white. And the police actually did make that change. They stopped marking them as Mex and started marking them as Caucasian. So they kind of won, in a sense. It's not that police brutality ended. They kind of won that battle in particular. But at almost the exact same time, you're starting to see people making the opposite argument, which is that we are not white, right? And they're doing that in the courts to win. They want to win recognition under the 14th Amendment, which is basically protection of their civil rights laws, right? So I don't have evidence that there's a particular, like, one single group of people making different arguments in different contexts.
I'm just wondering because it's all children, right? It's all teenagers in particular who are being affected by both of these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually do see examples of that in the subsequent decades.
You know, I just want to mention, I'm a historian and a genealogist.
Okay.
I researched southern Colorado and northern New Mexico.
I think we met at the WHA. You guys, you write genealogy?
Right.
Yes, we did meet.
Okay. Virginia Sanchez.
Yes.
Okay. And, you know, it's interesting, we talk about labels, but during the 1870-1880 census, Hispanos were labeled as M, Mexican, not white. In fact, it was a lot of times crossed out and M was put in.
I've seen that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually use with my students census records quite a bit to show the different categories that are used over time and why there are certain periods where a category will change but then maybe revert back. Mostly we talk about the 20th century because I'm a modern US historian. And so we talk about 1930 and why there's a Mexican category in 1930 and then why that goes away in 1940. So it's a really useful teaching tool to sort of talk to students about race as a social construction.
And also, when the term Chicano came out in Denver, then it was more referring back to their ancient Aztec ancestry.
Yeah.
And now, as we are doing more genealogical DNA research, especially in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico, we find more recent indigeneity.
Oh, really?
Yes, of American indigenous groups.
Yeah, that's not surprising to me, but also very fascinating research. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Genealogy is fascinating to me. Do we have time for?
Can I just ask one last question? So I'm also curious about what what sort of thinking about these Mexican American parents who are deploying colorblind rhetoric So say like the Swansea parents, if we put them in a bigger context where we've got other Mexican American parents who, I'm thinking of like 3 other decisions that people are making at this time. So one is to move to suburbs, right? Like especially northern and western suburbs of Denver, I guess eastern suburbs as well. So you've got those parents, and of course that's like classed in terms of who can access it. Then we've got when you show the statistics of racial change in Denver schools, part of what that's reflecting, is white flight, but you also have some Mexican American parents living in the district, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then we have we have what's going on within parochial schools.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm also thinking about, the Chicana movement, there's like Escuela,
Yep.
Alta Loco, right? There's sort of separatist schooling.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does colorblindness fit within those other choices that some Mexican American parents are making when it comes to responding to keys and all of that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, for the ones who are leaving the Denver schools for the suburbs, that's definitely a function of class. You're right. And I think that perhaps I would have to need to be more evidence for that, but my assumption would be that reflects also not just an economic reality, but a buying into a colorblind racial ideology, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised, but I can't say for certain whether that's coming into play. For the people sort of leaving the Denver schools and either going to parochial schools, which that does happen, there is a good number of Mexican American families who take their students out of the DPS schools and put them in the Catholic schools. That does happen. And then a good number leaving to go to La Escuela as well, which is the Crusade for Justice school. And I think that the reason that school is created is because they get so frustrated with the Denver public schools and the fact that desegregation is taking up so much of the district's time that they're like, we're just gonna remove ourselves from this situation and start our own school. And it's difficult to say like how much colorblindness is influencing that decision, other than to say I think Corky Gonzalez was very smart as a leader of the Crusade for Justice and could see the writing on the wall, that this colorblindness was really gaining traction in this period and that it was going to be that much more difficult to challenge what was happening in the schools. And so again, we'll just take ourselves outside of it. I don't know that that's the case. Again, just assuming it's kind of just guessing at this point, but I would think that he would be able to see that. It's a hard question.
Yeah. Well, like your point about Corky's astuteness, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely fits. Okay. Well, we've got books in the back that I'm sure Dr. Olden would be more than pleased to sign for you all. And come on up and ask any questions you didn't have time to ask during the Q&A session. And thank you all for being here. And we give Dr. Olden a round of applause.